Shahid was denied naturalization partly because, as the judge noted, he was, quote, somewhat darker than the usual mulatto. Those are the exact words of the judge. Hi, I'm Danielle Romero. Thank you so much for being with me here on my channel where we talk about American identity and family stories. And I did a big series last summer where I was looking at court cases. Some were Supreme Court cases, some were lower court cases about immigrants wanting to become naturalized, become U.S. citizens, and how they had to argue that they were either white or of African descent. Now, that was the law of the time. And so I want to talk a little bit about the Syrian experience of becoming white in America. And you may or may not be familiar with the legal weight of the phrase white. It actually has legal standing, or it did, in the United States. That's something that the founding fathers actually, they folded into the new country. In 1790, we had the Naturalization Act that said you had to be a free white man of good character in order to become a U.S. citizen. There was no specifying what white meant. I want to tell you another story about what it means to become an American and how many immigrants fought for that right, and how the color of your skin can turn into an open court case. So I want to tell you about the Syrians who came to America and found themselves suddenly navigating the murky waters of American identity. Now, actually, I interviewed a daughter of a Syrian immigrant a couple months ago. She is a musician here in Nashville, and I'll link to that video at the end so you can kind of hear a little bit about her family story. So this story, though, really kicks off in the late 19th and 20th centuries. Syrians began to cross oceans to find their place as Americans. One immigrant famously said, quote, "I came to America because I heard the streets were paved with gold. When I got here, I found out three things. First, the streets weren't paved with gold. Second, they weren't paved at all. And third, I was expected to pave them." I think these encapsulate the hopes of many immigrants, not just Syrians, who sought better lives away from their homeland, which often was going through a socio-political turmoil, only to face a new set of struggles in proving who they were. But we have to actually go back even further than the 19th and 20th century. Nathan Badin was possibly the first Syrian documented in the USA, or what was to become the USA, because he actually donned a uniform and he fought against the British. He was killed in 1776, so a patriot by all measures. But to understand this journey, we have to go to 1790. If you've been on my channel and you haven't gotten to any of the videos where we talk about the Naturalization Act, this is the foundation for everything I've been understanding. The Naturalization Act, so to naturalize means to become a citizen of. It stated that you had to be a free white man of good character to become a citizen of the United States. Now, this year is essential because it set a legal cornerstone, but the language was vague and open for interpretation. Well, who is white? This ambiguity would lead to countless courtroom battles over who was deemed white enough to become an American. Philip Hitty estimated that from 1899 to 1919, there were around 90,000 people from what was then Ottoman Syria, and they settled primarily in the eastern United States. But many of them were written down as Turks because the name Syrian really hadn't even gained currency until the turn of the century. So these folks often found work as peddlers, sellers of trinkets. Now, the peddler life, though, sparked quite a bit of academic debate. Alexa Naff was the first one to author a book on this subject and argued that this life of pack peddling was their American dream and that this was a launch pad to give Syrians new avenues to build networks and settle into the American fabric. An 1890 Harper's Weekly article described Syrian peddling model as a simple and essentially Asiatic model. And according to this account, Syrians would audaciously ask for 10 times the worth of their products, employing psychological tactics to close the sale. So that was kind of the way that they were seen at the time. Now, we need to jump to 1913. This is our first court case. It's Faris Shahid in 1913. Shahid was denied naturalization partly because, as the judge noted, he was, quote, somewhat darker than the usual mulatto. Those are the exact words of the judge. This statement highlights the arbitrary and deeply entrenched racial biases of the time. You don't need me to tell you. what was happening in 1913 in the United States. We're about to have the second rise of the Klan, the return of the Klan, and the movie The Birth of a Nation is kind of gaining traction at this time, or is about to gain traction at this time. And so for Shahid's case, this wasn't necessarily a legal battle. It's a stark reminder of the racial barrier that many immigrants had to navigate. So Shahid had actually been in America for 11 years by this point, but his limited understanding of spoken English and his inability to read or write the language posed significant hurdles. As a married Christian man whose wife and children lived in Syria, he sought naturalization so he could bring his family over with him to America. However, when he was asked if he was a polygamist or a person who rejects the government, Shahid mistakenly answered affirmatively due to the language barrier. And so the questions were posed in English rather than Arabic, and so he wasn't really able to understand the questions that were being asked. I want to jump to another court case for another man. So imagine for a moment now we're in 1909. Jazz is in its infancy. The Ford Model T has just hit the street. But in the heart of America's legal system, a contentious question of identity has been taking center stage. What makes someone white? This question was steeped in the socio-political climate of the times. And this would profoundly impact the life of one man who just wanted to serve and protect as a policeman in Venice, California. Now, George had arrested the son of a prominent lawyer for disturbing the peace. Now, you think that'd be a straightforward incident, right? Wrong. This arrest ignited a legal and existential battle that delved into the nitty-gritty of American citizenship and racial categorization. Why? Because the man that Shashim arrested challenged the very right for him to do that, claiming, quote, "You're not even an American citizen because you're not white." Now enter Chief Richard K. Campbell of the Bureau of Naturalization. Remember, that has to do with immigrants becoming Americans. He insisted that Middle Easterners like Shishim belong to the yellow race, not the white race. And in the corridors of justice in Washington, D.C., William H. Harr, the Attorney General Assistant for Naturalization, declared, "We need to investigate this. Like, hold on. Like, we need to stop and figure out how we're going to handle this." Letters were sent to universities, and one consistent answer emerged. The Lebanese, the Syrians, and the Arabs as a whole belonged to the white race. During the emotionally charged court hearings, George Shishim delivered a line that would reverberate for a long time, and it's pretty wild. Get ready for this. He said, quote, "If I am a Mongolian, then so was Jesus, because we came from the same land." All right, I want to introduce one more man. This is George Dow, and he makes his first appearance in this tale right around the same time, 1914. He sought citizenship, but he was flatly rejected for being, quote, Asiatic. He famously queried the court something similar. He said, quote, "The birthplace of Christ is located in Asia, and the cradle of Christianity cannot produce a white person." Dow's arguments were rooted in the scientific theories of the era, particularly those promulgated by the German physician Blumenbach. So he said, quote, "Modern Syrians are mixed Syrians, Arabians, and even Jewish blood. They belong to the Semitic branch of the Caucasian race and thus differ widely from their rulers, the Turks, who are in origin Mongolian." And so to Dow and his counsel, this was a compelling evidence of his whiteness under the 1790 Act. But the judicial bench actually adhered to a more colloquial interpretation of white. That's the man on the street interpretation. If you pass someone on the street without knowing their background, what would you think they were? And he equated this to having largely European ancestry. So this was 1915. And upon Dow's appeal to the Court of Appeals, the scientific definition actually clinched the case in his favor. It's critical to note that the first Arab Muslim, this is a quote, would not gain the legal right to be naturalized until the 1940s. So the 1915 case divided Arab immigrants along the lines of religion, which is fascinating. So first you have the immigrants being kind of separated by color. But once we have done this, now the Christian Syrians are allowed to naturalize and become white, but the other Arab immigrants who are Muslim are not until the 40s. And it's amazing to come and end up in the courtroom over battles of the color of your skin. It's shocking, but it's not shocking based on the time. You know, I think if this teaches us anything, it's that American identity isn't just skin deep, right? It's a constant tug of war between perception, history. So I think when we're looking at these words today, we have to understand that they were not being used the same way in the past. They didn't mean the same thing in the past. And I think that's a hugely important part of studying history, is that just because I'm reading a document in 2024 and I see words that I recognize, it doesn't mean those words were the application wasn't necessarily the same. The approach of what that word meant wasn't necessarily the same. And I think you could see that here with the word white. So the stories of these early Syrian immigrants, I think this is profoundly relevant, but I think it's because it reminds us of the fluid nature of these racial classifications. The conversations that began in the courtrooms are still conversations we're having today. We're having them about different people in different ways today, but we are. And what has been really interesting to me is I've been on this very open, transparent journey of learning in public with you, making mistakes along the way, right? But learning this stuff with you, is that I went into this last summer before studying any of these court cases, believing that I understood what the phrase white meant. Like, it was super clear cut. Who doesn't know who white is? And now I can see that that is not the case, that even the Supreme Court justices didn't really know how to explain white. And that it really was so much more of the colloquial thing. If someone looks at you and they think you're white, then you're white. And it's like, well, that's not a really great way to decide how we let people like naturalize. You know what I'm saying? So there it is. The journey of some of the Arab immigrants that came here, the Syrian experience. And I think the conversation is unfinished. A lot of the issues that we're having right now are because, you know, if you think of the issues, if we're thinking on a superficial level and you see a little sprout or a little plant coming up out of the ground and you don't understand what's holding that plant in the ground, you don't understand how deep that root system goes and what the origin story is of this terminology, of what was happening here, it's easy to get confused. But I think it's important to always go back to the primary sources and look at that for yourself. So please look at these court cases for yourself. I'll link to some sources for you. And if you're interested in seeing videos I've done on how the Greeks became white, the Armenians became white, or the interview with the daughter of a Syrian immigrant, I will leave those below for you. And I would love to have you join me over on my secret new channel. Much more lighthearted. It's with my husband, of just a low-key sit-down style, talking about life and not necessarily history. So I'd love to see you over there. It's at Uncultured Wine. Otherwise, we'll talk soon.